On a Tuesday morning in October of 2019, Dale Whitmore stood at the edge of his east field and watched $8,000 an hour walk away from him. The soybeans were ready. 3 days past ready, if he was being honest with himself. The pods were tight and dry, the stalks brittle enough to snap between two fingers, and the forecast showed rain coming in from the northwest. Not a sprinkle, not a passing shower, but 4 days of steady rain that would flatten everything he'd spent the last 9 months growing. He had 600 acres of soybeans waiting to come out of the ground, a buyer lined up at the elevator in Harlan, and a harvest window that was closing by the hour. What he did not have was a combine that would start. Let me tell you about what happened in Shelby County, Iowa in the fall of 2019, because it is one of those stories that sounds made up until you understand exactly how it happened, and then it sounds inevitable. Dale was not alone that morning. In the 4 townships surrounding Erling, Iowa, 11 other farming operations were sitting on combines that would not move. Not because anything had broken, not because of a mechanical failure, a worn belt, a cracked cylinder, or a bad fuel pump. The machines were physically perfect. Every bearing was greased, every chain was tight, every hydraulic line was holding pressure. The problem was invisible, and it had arrived overnight, delivered through a satellite connection that none of the farmers had asked for, and most of them hadn't known existed. The manufacturer, one of the major equipment companies whose green and yellow colors you know the moment you see them, had pushed a mandatory firmware update to their fleet of precision combines the night before. It was a routine update, the kind that gets pushed dozens of times a year to manage telematics, update GPS calibration, adjust harvest settings, and patch security vulnerabilities. Under normal circumstances, the update would download overnight, install during the machine's idle period, and the operator would wake up to a combine that ran exactly as it had before, only with a slightly newer version number buried in a diagnostic menu that nobody ever opened. Under normal circumstances, the farmer would never know it happened. These were not normal circumstances. The update contained a licensing verification module, a new piece of code designed to confirm that the machine's software license was current and that the machine was authorized to operate in its current configuration. It was a response to a growing gray market in modified firmware, in cracked diagnostic software, in third-party tuning tools that let farmers adjust fuel curves and engine parameters beyond the manufacturer's intended limits. The company had legal reasons to care about this. They had warranty reasons. They had liability reasons. They had reasons that made complete sense in a boardroom in Moline, Illinois, and absolutely no sense at all standing in a soybean field in Shelby County, Iowa, with rain coming in from the northwest. The verification module had a bug. When it ran on machines registered to certain dealer territories, specifically those served through a regional distribution hub that had updated its own licensing server 2 weeks earlier, it returned a false negative on the authorization check. The machines read as unlicensed, and the machines, which had been designed with a kill switch that prevented operation of unlicensed equipment, did what they were designed to do. They stopped. Every combine in those 4 townships that ran the manufacturer's current generation of precision harvest software, the JDS 790s, the S780s, the 2 S770s that the Hennessy brothers had bought the spring before and were still making payments on, sat completely inert. The engines would turn over. The cabs would power up. The displays would come on and show you everything: header height, reel speed, rotor clearance, moisture readings, all of it live and responsive. But the moment you engaged the separator, the moment you tried to put the machine to work, a warning appeared on the display. It was a small warning, professionally formatted, with the manufacturer's logo in the corner. It said, "Operation suspended. License verification required. Contact your dealer." Dale Whitmore called his dealer at 6:45 in the morning. He was the third person to call. By 7:15, there were 9 messages in the service queue. By 8 o'clock, there were 22, and the service manager at the dealership in Harlan had escalated the issue to the regional technical support line, which had escalated it to the manufacturer's software division, which had opened a critical incident ticket and assigned it to an engineering team that was, at that moment, 3 time zones away and 2 hours from starting their workday. Let me tell you about what the next 4 days looked like for Dale Whitmore, because you need to understand the full weight of what was happening before you can understand why what came next matters. The dealership sent a technician that first morning, a young man named Cody, 24 years old, 2 years out of technical school, competent and genuinely trying. Cody had his laptop, his factory diagnostic software, his service manuals, and his direct line to the manufacturer's technical support team. He spent 7 hours on Dale's combine. He ran every diagnostic the software would allow him to run. He reflashed the firmware twice, attempting to roll back the update, but the machine's software architecture had been designed to prevent rollback, a feature intended to stop operators from reverting to older firmware versions that lacked current safety patches. He called technical support 4 times. He was on hold for a combined total of 2 hours and 40 minutes. The manufacturer's engineers were working the problem from their end, they said. A patch was being developed. It would be deployed as soon as it was validated. They could not give a timeline. Cody left at 6 in the evening with nothing fixed, and the sincere apology of a man who understood the gravity of what he could not solve. The patch came on day 2. It did not work. It addressed the licensing verification error for machines registered in one subset of the affected dealer territory but not the other, and Dale's machine was in the other. A second patch came on day 3. It worked for 6 of the 11 affected machines in the county. Dale's was not among the 6. The rain arrived on schedule, as Iowa rain always does. It started on the afternoon of day 3, a steady gray curtain moving in from the northwest exactly as the forecast had said it would. Dale stood in his kitchen and watched it come across the field and understood that he was going to lose a portion of his crop. Not all of it. The soybeans were dry enough that they'd survive some rain without catastrophic loss. But every day the rain continued. The pods would absorb moisture and swell, and when they dried again, the beans would be graded lower. His contract price would hold, but the elevator would dock him for moisture content, and the beans that had been at ideal harvest moisture 2 days ago would now cost him somewhere between $30 and $60 an acre in discounts and shrink. On 600 acres, that was real money. That was between $18,000 and $36,000, and it was walking away from him while an engineering team in Illinois worked through a software problem that had nothing to do with his crop, his soil, his equipment, or anything he had done. On day 4, his neighbor drove over. Let me tell you about Gerald Harms, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Gerald was 71 years old and had farmed the same 480 acres in Shelby County his entire life. His father had farmed it before him, and his father's father had broken the original ground in the 1920s, back when this part of Iowa was still being settled by families who came out from Ohio and Indiana with nothing but a team of horses and the intention to stay. The Harms farm sat on the south side of County Road F58, about a mile and a half west of Erlin, and if you drove past it without knowing what you were looking at, you might have thought it was a working farm museum. The machine shed was full of equipment that other people had sold for scrap decades ago, and Gerald had bought it, maintained it, and kept it running because that was what Gerald did. He did not throw things away. He did not believe that new was better simply because it was new. He believed that a machine that was built correctly regardless of when it was built, and that the people who made that machine understood something that the people who came later had sometimes forgotten. Gerald had farmed with modern equipment for most of his life. He had owned John Deere combines, Case YH combines, a New Holland at one point that he'd traded after 2 seasons because he didn't like the rotor design. He understood modern harvest equipment the way a man understands tools he has used for 50 years. Not from a manual, but from the inside out. From the particular sound a rotor makes when it's working right versus when it's working wrong. From the way a machine moves through heavy crop versus light crop. From 10,000 small observations accumulated across half a century of harvests. He had sold his last modern combine in 2009 when the precision agriculture system started becoming mandatory rather than optional, when the machines started requiring dealer-level software access for repairs that he'd always done himself, when the equipment started talking back to him in error codes instead of mechanical symptoms. He had not replaced it. What Gerald had instead was a 1979 John Deere 6600 combine that had belonged to his father. It was not a small machine. The 6600 was a serious piece of harvest equipment in its day, a conventional cylinder and straw walker design that had been the backbone of Midwest grain farming for a generation. Gerald had rebuilt it twice. He had replaced the cylinder bars, the concaves, the straw walkers, the feeder house chain, the cleaning shoe, the sieves. He had rebuilt the engine once and the hydrostatic drive twice. The machine had no computer. It had no GPS. It had no telematics, no satellite connection, no software license, no firmware. It had a steering wheel, a throttle, a cylinder speed adjustment, a concave clearance adjustment, and a set of gauges that told you oil pressure, coolant temperature, and engine speed. Everything it did mechanically. Everything that could go wrong with it, Gerald could fix with tools he kept in the machine shed and knowledge he kept in his head. He had combined 480 acres with it every fall for the last 10 years. His neighbors thought he was stubborn. His son thought he was sentimental. Gerald thought he was practical. He pulled into Dale Whitmore's yard on the morning of day 4, the rain coming down in a steady gray drizzle, the 6600 riding on a flatbed trailer behind his pickup. Dale came out of the house and stood on the porch and looked at the machine on the trailer, and then looked at Gerald and did not say anything for a moment. "Heard you got trouble," Gerald said. "Computer locked it out," Dale said. "Firmware update. They're working on a patch. How long? Don't know. Could be today. Could be next week." Gerald looked at the field. The soybeans were still standing, bent a little from the rain. The pods swollen with moisture they hadn't had 4 days ago. "What are you docked so far?" "Probably $40 an acre if I pull them today. More tomorrow." Gerald nodded. He did not say anything dramatic. He did not make a speech. He said, "My machine doesn't have a computer. You want to run your beans through it, we can start this afternoon." Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone struggle with a problem you already knew how to solve and had to wait for them to be ready to hear the answer? Gerald Harms had been watching his neighbors buy increasingly complicated equipment for 20 years. He had watched them pay dealer rates for repairs he could have done himself. He had watched them finance machines at interest rates that would have made his father pale. He had never said a word about any of it, because it was not his farm and not his decision, and because Gerald Harms was not a man who told other people how to live. But he had kept the 6600 running. He'd kept it registered and insured and in the shed with a full tank of diesel, not because he was waiting to be right, but because he genuinely believed it was the better tool for his operation. That it turned out to be the right tool for his neighbor's crisis was not something he had planned. It was simply what happened when a man maintains what he has instead of chasing what's new. Dale Whitmore said yes. Let me tell you about the conversation that happened at the Harlan Equipment dealership 2 days before Gerald showed up, because it is part of this story even though Gerald wasn't there. Dale had driven into Harlan on day 2, after the first patch failed, to talk to the service manager face-to-face. His name was Brett Sellers, and Brett was good at his job. He was 41 years old, had been in agricultural equipment sales and service for 15 years, and he knew his product line the way a man knows something he has staked his livelihood on. He was not dismissive of Dale's problem. He was genuinely, visibly distressed about it. But when Dale mentioned, almost offhandedly, mostly thinking out loud, that Gerald Harms had offered to bring his old 6600 over to run the beans, Brett's expression changed. It did not become hostile. It became something more complicated than that. It became the expression of a man who has organized his professional life around a particular set of beliefs and has just heard something that challenges them in a way he does not have a ready answer for. He said, "Dale, that machine is 40 years old. It's going to shatter beans. Your harvest loss is going to be worse than your moisture dockage." He said it with confidence, with the authority of a man who had sold a lot of combines and knew their specifications. He said it the way people say things they believe completely. Dale nodded and said he'd think about it. The silence in the dealership lasted about 2 seconds after Dale walked out. Then Brett turned to his parts manager and said, "Gerald Harms and that old 6600. Jesus." He said it the way you say something you find both sad and slightly ridiculous, the way you talk about a man who's too attached to the past to see the present clearly. The parts manager smiled. Neither of them said anything else about it. What Brett Sellers did not know, and what Gerald Harms had spent 50 years learning, was that the 6600's conventional cylinder and concave threshing system, when properly set, concave clearance at the right gap for soybean moisture content, cylinder speed dialed back to the appropriate RPM for the current conditions, was extraordinarily gentle on beans. The rotor combines that had replaced the conventional design in the 1980s and 1990s were faster and had higher capacity, but they were also more aggressive. At high moisture, the rotor design was superior. At the dry to slightly damp conditions that Dale's beans were now in after 4 days of rain and then partial drying, the conventional cylinder was, in the hands of someone who knew how to set it, actually quite competitive. Gerald had been running conventional equipment on soybeans for 50 years. He knew exactly where to set the concave for every moisture condition between 8% and 16%. He knew it not from a chart, but from the sound the machine made and the look of the sample coming out of the clean grain elevator. They started that afternoon. The rain had lightened to an intermittent drizzle, not ideal, but the beans were at a moisture level that was workable. Gerald drove the 6600 into the field himself for the first pass, getting a feel for the crop, adjusting the concave by hand. A physical lever, no touchscreen, no automated settings, until the sample looked right. He checked the loss behind the machine by hand, walking the first 100 feet of his pass and counting beans on the ground. He adjusted. He checked again. He drove another 100 feet and checked again. It took him 45 minutes to get the machine dialed in to his satisfaction. Then he opened it up. The 6600 moved through that soybean field the way a machine moves when it was designed for exactly this work and is being operated by someone who understands it completely. It was not fast. Gerald was running about 4 miles per hour, which was slower than the modern combines that had been paralyzed in their sheds. But it was steady and it was clean. The sample coming out of the grain tank was good. The loss behind the machine was minimal. Dale walked behind for the first hour, checking the ground, and what he found was that Brett Sellers had been wrong. The machine was not shattering beans. The machine was threshing them cleanly, gently, at a harvest loss rate that was within normal parameters for the conditions. Dale called his son in from the far field where he'd been doing tillage, and they ran 2 machines, the 6600 and Dale's smaller, older International one, 48. Oh, that had been sitting in the shed unused because the JD was bigger and faster, and they worked through the rain-dampened soybeans across 4 days, and they got the crop out. Not without cost. The moisture dockage was real. The beans that came out of that field after 4 days of rain were not the beans that would have come out 4 days earlier. Dale estimated his total loss, between the moisture dockage and the slightly elevated harvest loss from running 2 smaller machines instead of one large modern one, at somewhere around $22,000. It was a real number. It hurt. But let me tell you about what the Hennessy brothers lost, because their patch never came through in time either, and they did not have a Gerald Harms next door. They had hired a custom harvester from 3 counties away, a man with a different brand of combine that wasn't affected by the update, and they had paid him custom harvest rates on top of the moisture dockage, and by the time the rain was done and the beans were out of the ground, their total loss was closer to $41,000. And the Hennessy brothers were not unique. Across those 4 townships, the farms that had found alternative solutions, old equipment, custom harvesters, neighbors with different brands, had losses that ranged from $18,000 to $30,000. The farms that had waited for the patch, that had trusted that the manufacturer would resolve the issue before the window closed completely, had losses that ranged from $35,000 to $60,000. The patch came on day 6. By then, for most of the affected operations, it did not matter. Let me tell you about the morning Brett Sellers drove out to the Harms farm, because it is the part of this story that stays with you. It was a Saturday, about 2 weeks after the harvest was finished. The fields were empty and brown, the sky the particular flat gray of Iowa in November, the kind of sky that looks like it was painted by someone who ran out of other colors. Brett drove out in his pickup, the dealership logo on the door, and pulled into Gerald's yard. Gerald was in the machine shed, which is where Gerald always was in November, going through the 6600, checking everything that the harvest season had used, replacing what needed replacing, lubricating what needed lubricating, getting the machine ready for the following year. Brett stood in the door of the machine shed for a moment before Gerald noticed him. Gerald was on his back under the feeder house, checking the chain tension, and when he slid out and saw who was standing there, he sat up slowly and looked at him without saying anything. Brett said, "I owe you an apology, Gerald, and I owe Dale one too." Gerald picked up a rag and wiped his hands. He did not say that Brett didn't owe him anything, the way some men would have. He did not wave it off. He just waited. Brett said, "I told Dale that machine would shatter his beans. I was wrong." He paused. "I've been selling combines for 15 years, and I've never seen a 6600 set up the way yours is. I didn't think it could do what it did." Gerald looked at the machine for a moment. The 6600 sat in the shed the way it always sat, enormous and quiet, the paint worn in the places where 40 years of use had worn it, the cylinder housing scratched and dented in the particular way that working equipment gets scratched and dented. It did not look impressive. It looked like what it was, an old machine that had been kept running by someone who understood it. "It's not magic," Gerald said. "It's just set right. You set any machine right, it'll do what it's supposed to do." Brett nodded. He said, "The thing I keep thinking about is the software, the fact that it locked everybody out. Does that bother you? That they can do that?" Gerald considered this for a moment. "It bothers me that people bought machines they can't fix themselves," he said. "The locking out is just what happens after that. You give somebody else control of something you depend on, you've got to live with the decisions they make." He stood up, his knees taking a moment to straighten. "I've got coffee inside if you want it." Brett Sellers stayed for an hour. He drank 2 cups of coffee and asked Gerald about the 6600, about the cylinder speed settings, about the concave adjustment, about how Gerald knew where to set it for different moisture conditions. Gerald answered every question with the patience of a man who has spent his life learning things and does not mind sharing them. He did not lecture. He did not make Brett feel foolish for not knowing. He just explained, the way a man explains something he understands completely and has no reason to be secretive about. When Brett left, he sat in his pickup for a moment before starting it. He looked at the machine shed, at the 6600 visible through the open door. Then he started the truck and drove back to Harlan. Let me tell you about what changed after that fall, because the story does not end with the harvest. The Firmware incident, that is what it came to be called in the agricultural press, though the manufacturer's official communications used more careful language about a software deployment issue affecting a subset of licensed units in certain dealer territories, generated a significant amount of coverage in farm publications and agricultural trade media. The coverage was factual and measured. It documented the scope of the problem, the timeline of the patches, the estimated crop losses, and the manufacturer's response, which included a formal acknowledgement of the issue and a compensation program for affected operators. The compensation program was not generous by most assessments, but it existed, which was more than some people had expected. What the coverage also documented, in several of the longer pieces, was the experience of farmers who had found alternatives. Gerald Harms was quoted in one of them, a piece in a regional farm publication that had gotten his name from Dale Whitmore. Gerald said in the piece approximately what he had said to Brett Sellers in his kitchen, that the locking out was not the real problem, that the real problem was the loss of the operator's ability to maintain and repair their own equipment, and that a machine you cannot fix yourself is a machine that someone else controls. The quote circulated. It appeared in several places online. It generated, for a few weeks, a considerable amount of discussion about right-to-repair legislation, about the terms of use buried in equipment purchase agreements, about what it meant to own a machine that required manufacturer authorization to operate. Gerald did not follow any of this discussion. He did not have social media. He did not read the agricultural trade press. He knew the quote had circulated because his son told him, and he nodded and went back to what he was doing, which was rebuilding the feeder house on the 6600 in preparation for the following year. Let me tell you about what happened the following fall, because this is the part that matters most. The manufacturer had issued a revised firmware update policy by then. They had implemented a new protocol requiring that any mandatory update affecting machine operability be subject to a 72-hour operator opt-out window during active harvest season, and they had established a dedicated harvest season support line with guaranteed 4-hour response times. These were real improvements. They reflected genuine institutional learning from what had happened in the fall of 2019. The people at the company were not bad people, and they were not indifferent to what had happened. They had made a mistake in a complicated system, and they had tried to correct it. But in Shelby County, Iowa, something else had happened too. Dale Whitmore had bought a 1982 John Deere 772. Oh, a conventional combine, not to replace his modern machine, but to keep in the shed. He had paid $11,000 for it, which was not nothing, and he had spent another $3,000 getting it into reliable running condition. He had asked Gerald to help him set it up, and Gerald had spent 2 Saturdays in Dale's machine shed going through the machine with him, showing him the concave adjustment, the cylinder speed, the cleaning shoe settings, the things that you learn by doing rather than by reading. Dale's son had been there for both Saturdays, watching and asking questions, and by the end of the second Saturday he could set the machine himself. 2 other farms in the area had done similar things. Not all of them had bought conventional combines. One had bought a used machine of a different brand entirely, specifically to avoid single-brand dependency. One had simply bought a different model year, old enough to predate the precision agriculture software architecture that had caused the problem. None of them had abandoned their modern equipment. They were not making a statement about technology. They were making an insurance decision, the way a farmer makes insurance decisions, quietly and practically and without drama. Gerald Harms noticed this and said nothing about it. He did not take credit. He did not point out that he had been doing this for 10 years already. He just noticed it the way he noticed everything, carefully, without comment, filing it away. Let me tell you about the harvest of 2022, because it is the last piece of this story, and it is the piece that closes the circle. The fall of 2022 was a complicated harvest season in western Iowa. There were no software issues. The manufacturer's revised protocols had held, and the 2019 incident had not repeated itself. But there was a different problem, the kind of problem that does not come from a boardroom in Moline, but from the sky. September and October of 2022 brought an extended stretch of wet weather, not catastrophic, not a flood, but persistent and grinding. Week after week of alternating rain and partial drying that kept field conditions marginal and pushed harvest into November. The soybeans that came out in that window were high moisture, and the modern combines, which are extraordinarily capable machines in the right conditions, were struggling. The precision harvest systems were doing their job, adjusting automatically to the conditions, but the conditions were at the edge of what the machines were designed to handle. Rotor losses were elevated, grain quality was marginal, every operation in the county was fighting the weather and fighting the clock. Gerald Harms was not fighting either. He was harvesting. The 6600 is a conventional design, and the conventional design has characteristics that become advantages in certain conditions. In high-moisture soybeans, the cylinder and concave system, set correctly, is more forgiving than a rotor. It is less aggressive. It handles the tough, damp crop with a kind of mechanical patience that the higher-speed rotor systems sometimes cannot match. Gerald had harvested in wet conditions before, many times across 50 years of Iowa falls, and he knew how to set the machine for what the crop was giving him. He ran slower. He adjusted the concave more frequently. He checked his loss monitor, not a digital readout but his own eyes and hands walking the rows behind the machine, and he adjusted again. He was not fast. He was not covering acres at the rate that a modern combine covers acres, but he was getting the crop out clean, and in that fall, in those conditions, clean mattered more than fast. Dale Whitmore ran both machines that fall, his modern combine and the 1982 772, he'd bought after the 2019 incident. His son ran the 772. On the days when the conditions were worst, when the moisture was highest and the rotor losses on the modern machine were climbing, Dale's son would pull ahead of his father in the field, running the older machine through the toughest sections while Dale held back and waited for conditions to improve. It was not a romantic arrangement. It was not a statement about old versus new. It was two machines doing what each of them did best, managed by people who understood both of them. Brett Sellers drove past Dale's field one afternoon in October of that year on his way to a service call at another farm, and he saw the two machines working, the big modern combine and the old 772 running parallel passes through the wet beans. He slowed down and watched for a moment. Then he drove on. He had been thinking since the fall of 2019 about the conversation he'd had with Gerald in the machine shed. He had been thinking about what Gerald had said, that the locking out is just what happens after you give somebody else control of something you depend on. He had thought about it in the context of his own business, about what it meant to sell machines that his customers could not repair themselves, about what the terms of use actually said about who owned what. He had not come to any dramatic conclusions. He was not about to stop selling modern equipment, which was genuinely better in most conditions and most years. But he had started asking different questions when he sat down with customers. He had started asking whether they had a backup plan, whether they had considered what they would do if their primary machine was down during a critical window, whether they had thought about what old iron, properly maintained, might be worth keeping around. Some of his customers thought it was an odd question for a dealer to ask. He told them about 2019, and they understood. Let me tell you about the last thing Gerald Harms said to his son about the 6600, because it is the thing his son has repeated to anyone who has asked him about the machine in the years since. Gerald died in the spring of 2024, at 76 years old, of a heart attack that came without warning on a Tuesday morning in April, when he was in the machine shed doing what he always did in April, going through the 6600, getting it ready for the season that was coming. His son found him there beside the machine, and the family buried him in the cemetery outside Erling, and the 6600 stayed in the machine shed where it had always been. Gerald's son, whose name is Paul, and who is 48 years old, and has farmed alongside his father for 25 years, has kept the machine running. He rebuilt the cylinder himself the summer after his father died, following the notes his father had kept in a spiral notebook that lived on the shelf above the workbench in the machine shed. The notes were not formal. They were the kind of notes a man writes for himself. Reminders, measurements, observations about what worked and what didn't, dates of repairs and parts used. They were the accumulated knowledge of a man who had paid close attention to one machine for a very long time, written down in the margins of his own experience. The last thing Gerald had said to Paul about the 6600, sometime in the winter before he died, was this: "Don't let anybody talk you into selling it because it's old. Old isn't the same as wrong. Old just means it's been tested longer." Paul has not sold it. Let me tell you about what happened in the fall of 2024, because the circle closes completely here, and because some stories insist on finishing themselves. Paul Harms was combining his soybeans on a Thursday afternoon in October when his phone rang. It was a number he recognized, Dale Whitmore's son, whose name is Kyle and who is 26 years old and has been farming with his father since he graduated from Iowa State 3 years ago. Kyle said, "Paul, you got a minute?" Paul shut down the header and sat in the cab of the 6600, the engine chuffing at idle, and said he had a minute. Kyle said that one of the Hennessy brothers, the younger one, Travis, who had taken over the operation from his father, had a problem. His combine was down. Not a firmware issue this time, something mechanical, a rotor failure that was going to take at least 5 days to repair, and he had 400 acres of soybeans standing in wet conditions with a forecast that looked familiar. Kyle said Travis had called the dealership, and the dealership had no loaner available. He said Travis had called 3 custom harvesters, and none of them could get there in under a week. He said Travis was, in Kyle's words, pretty well stuck. Paul said, "Tell him to pull in the yard whenever he's ready." He said it the way his father would have said it, without drama, without making Travis Hennessy feel the weight of what had happened in 2019, when the Hennessy brothers had waited for the patch that didn't come and had lost $41,000 while Gerald Harms's machine ran through the rain. He said it because that is what you do in Shelby County when a neighbor needs help, and because the 6600 was in the shed with a full tank of diesel, and because the soybeans were not going to wait. Travis Hennessy pulled into the Harms yard that evening and looked at the 6600 the way Dale Whitmore had looked at it 5 years before, with the particular expression of a man who is grateful and uncertain in equal measure. Paul showed him the machine. He showed him the concave adjustment, the cylinder speed, the cleaning shoe. He showed him how to check his loss by walking the rows. He showed him the spiral notebook on the shelf above the workbench, his father's notes, and told him that if he had questions about settings, the answers were probably in there. Travis harvested his 400 acres over the next 4 days. The loss was acceptable. The beans came out clean enough. On the last day, he found Paul in the machine shed and said, "I want to pay you for this." Paul said what his father would have said, which was that neighbors don't charge neighbors, and that if Travis wanted to do something, he could come help with the Harms corn when the time came. Travis said he would. He meant it. He drove home that evening thinking about the 6600. He thought about the fact that it had no computer. He thought about the fact that Paul Harms could fix anything that went wrong with it using tools in the machine shed and knowledge in a spiral notebook. He thought about his own combine, which was a magnificent machine. Faster, more capable, more precise in almost every measurable way, and which had a terms of use agreement that he had signed without reading carefully, that gave the manufacturer certain rights regarding software updates and remote diagnostics and licensing verification that he had not thought much about until the fall of 2019, and had not thought enough about since. He was not going to sell his modern combine. It was the right machine for his operation in most years and most conditions. But he was going to think differently about what it meant to depend on it completely. He was going to think about what a backup plan looked like, what old iron properly maintained was worth, what it meant to have a machine that you controlled entirely and that nobody could lock out with a firmware update delivered overnight through a satellite connection you hadn't asked for. He was going to think about the spiral notebook on the shelf above the workbench and what it represented. Not just a record of repairs, but a record of understanding, of one man's accumulated knowledge about one machine, written down so that it would not be lost when the man was gone. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. The 6600 sits in the Harms machine shed right now, tank full, concave set, the spiral notebook on the shelf above the workbench with Gerald's handwriting still clear on every page. The engineers in Moline say the modern machines are better, and in most ways they are right. Paul Harms says his father's machine does what it was built to do, and in every way that matters, he is also right. And in Shelby County, Iowa, when the firmware locks and the rain is coming and the soybeans are standing in the field, the question is not which answer is correct. The question is which machine is running. That's what happens when a man spends 50 years learning something well enough to write it down, and a son who was paying attention keeps the tank.